We have two very distinguished speakers for you to talk about Sass and how designers and developers can get along better with the use of style guides. And they will do a much better job than me of introducing their talk, so I'll let them do that. Just a reminder, check out our public meetup page for End Developers United for future events. We try to do these on the last Thursday of every month. And we'll have time for questions afterwards. So take it away.
Thank you very much. So my name is Krys Eppstein, and I work at caring.com. It's a website for people who take care of their parents or sick loved ones. And so does Krys Taylor.
I'm also at caring.com. Krys is our chief architect and resident genius, and I design the site.
And in addition to that, I work on Sass, and I built Compass and all that other good stuff. But I don't really want to tell you guys about the features of Sass and Compass. I think you guys, at least many of you, already know. What we wanted to share with you is a little bit about our designer-developer process and our workflow for how we implement our style guide and decide what all should be there. And so we titled this The Four Noble Truths of Style Sheets.
I'm a Buddhist, and one of the kind of foundations of Buddhist philosophy is that you have four noble truths. And so we decided that that applied very well to style sheets. The first noble truth is that you're suffering, and so were we. Well, you guys are suffering less than most. And style sheets are the source of the suffering.
You know, I think it's the nature of CSS and probably most software, but especially CSS, to devolve into madness in this kind of tangled web of interconnectedness. You just get a lot of spaghetti, and it's really hard to untangle it.
So the third noble truth is that you can be free from suffering. And the fourth is that living style guides and self-discipline are the key to being free from suffering.
And so I've noticed that there's this trade-off between development speed and flexibility. So you start out with like needing to speed things up, and that means you want to reuse things that already exist because you don't want to build them again. But the more you reuse things, the more you end up creating coupling between those things. And so that starts to reduce your flexibility over time. And you end up with a lot of repetition. So as you try to increase your flexibility, you end up getting more and more repetition, and that ends up reducing your development speed. And so there's this continual ebb and flow between how to make your development process work smoothly. And the goal was, I think, to find something right in the middle. And so when we first started at caring.com, we were just using plain old CSS, and I would get designers asking me questions like,
why is it so slow to make pages that look just like each other?
And so I started to reuse class names and try to save time by using CSS frameworks like Blueprint. And got pretty happy because we were able to build stuff quite fast.
But then I'd come along and I'd say, change just that bit there, would you?
And then I started to realize, like, yeah, well, if I change that, I'm going to end up affecting all these other things. Is that a fine?
And I'd be confused because those things totally aren't related in my mind.
So I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to need to not reuse classes all over the place because that's creating too much coupling. And so I started to move into a world where we would do a lot of, scoping in our selectors. So getting really using content semantics and really just using mix-ins to create our styles. And that gave us this ton of flexibility.
And that was great till I started saying things like, why is it so hard to roll out this same change across the entire website?
And so it was like, I just didn't know those things were related.
But of course they are.
And so we ended up coming up to this point where we realized we needed to make design-oriented concepts that could vary in appearance, and that we really needed to start working together to create this stuff.
So we created a design concept framework. And then I could say, change how this concept looks, or use this concept instead.
And that was no problem at all.
And I was happy.
But I don't think that, so I think that the key to getting this right is to really come up with great names for the concepts that you're creating. And when you really get the naming right, the maintainability tends to follow. I don't think this is just a style sheet concept. I think anybody who writes code in general probably finds this to be true. So what makes a good name? Wait, how do I, so.
He's sick, it's not his fault.
That's not the reason. So how do you know if a name is really appropriate? Like, because the appropriateness of the name is really how it's going to judge the maintainability of that. And so I think it boils down to having a name that's, the concepts need to be quite independent of each other. So if you change one, you're not changing other, you're not affecting other concepts in your domain. And also, but if there's going to be relationships, and so if those relationships are there, using naming to really create unambiguous relationships between them. And the other thing is, it's okay to have other concepts like that aren't necessarily in your application domain as long as they're there supporting the concepts that are part of your application domain. So what makes a good name?
Well, a good name is short. It's 1 or 2 words, or maybe 2 words you smash together to make one new word. It conveys understanding about a concept, so it's clear and it's descriptive, and it omits little knowledge about its concept, so it doesn't leave a lot of questions unanswered. But you have to be careful because naming a concept changes it. There's this ancient thought that a name has a lot of power. And in this case, it is true because if I name something with a word that has a connotation to the person who's going to hear that word, then I've just modified my concept to be whatever that connotation is. So not only have I fixed it in place and I've limited it to what I've just named it, I've also changed it slightly. So Krys says that misunderstood and misused names are the source of most software defects.
And that's just because you'll go in and you'll start using it the way you think you understand it, and then someone else who understands it in a different way will come along and they'll change it, and then you have unintended change. So the other key thing that we found is to really just accept the constraints that the browser gives us. I think that there's, we have to build on this platform, and if you are fighting the platform itself, you're just going to be sad all the time.
And that's true whether you're a developer or a designer. It doesn't matter.
And so I've gone and kind of tried to categorize the different layers / slices of kinds of constraints that the browser gives us, and then we try to pick names that fit within each one of these groups. So the first thing we do is we use a reset. We use Eric Meyer's reset, actually. It just brings everything down to the bare minimum. Some sites, depending on their design, tend to want to use more of a normalized approach. Whichever one works for you is really fine. And of course, CSS is additive by nature, so your styles are going to inherit down the document tree. They're going to cascade together. And the more that you can do to opt into the styles that you want, as opposed to trying to constantly remove the things that are there, but you were like, oops, I didn't want that. So if you find yourself trying to turn off styles, that tells you that you've gone and muddied up the waters too much. And so I think that there's like a lot of people build these little modules. They look not unlike this. There's some text and background and all kinds of things. And so I want to show you kind of how we deconstruct objects and then reconstruct them back. So first we start with, this is just the content that's been completely reset. And then we'll add a background to it. You cannot see it on this browser. This is green and there's little swirlies.
It's very pretty.
And then we put it in a container so that now it's got borders and a shadow. We add some typography to it. So typography for us is not just the font family, but it's how all the elements that are typographically related look. And then apply a foreground coloring to it.
Which you also can't see, but it's beautiful.
And then you get your complete object. This added a little bit of spacing here. Yeah, some margins and paddings. So these are fundamental building blocks of CSS. And so we've gone and we tried to make sure that all of the concepts that we create fit neatly into one of these buckets when we're designing elements. So the next major style concern is page layout. So page layout, the way we've approached this is we start by creating a grid system. And then on top of that grid system, we'll define a per media type grid. And then with those media types, we'll define layouts on top of that. So I have some slides here to kind of show how that works together. So here's the grids that we create. And then we'll create a layout, and then we'll put like the different elements there kind of on top of the grid. And then this layout will get a name, something like template 1 or main template or however you want to call it.
We use more descriptive names.
And so this is just a few examples of the different layouts we've created.
This is in our version of DaVinci. So this is an actual page on our site.
So this will be a 2-column layout, our 2-column layout with the content order switched. And we have a 3-column layout, and in theory you could have more. But notice that the layout has a media behavior, and that's all built into the layouts. And then the objects themselves, they don't know how wide they're going to be. It's always important to make sure that when you're building an object, that the object can expand to fill whatever space it's given by its layout. So the next major concern that I mentioned is typography, and so for that we use a vertical rhythm. Have you guys used vertical rhythm much? Yeah, I'm seeing some nodded heads. Awesome. I think it just really makes for a beautiful page, easy to read. It's not one of those things that you can pick up on right away, but it just gives you the sense of like, ah.
Well, there's been some research done that people actually feel more comfortable and relaxed when viewing pages that use proper vertical rhythm.
And the other thing that we do that's, I think, pretty non-standard for the industry is we don't use the normalize, but we don't even style like the body tag or anything else like that. So we have no typography on our site until you start to opt in with at least one class. Like we'll put reading text on the article element or whatever, and then we'll start to see typographic styles.
And this is really useful because we have 4 different typography sets for our site, so we never have clashes.
And then, of course, there's lots of interactive elements that I call widgets. And I could give a whole talk just on how to build widgets correctly. But instead, I'm just going to say that what Jonathan Snook says in the Smacks book is really awesome. So if you guys have read that, show of hands, has anybody read that? Do you guys like it? Cool. So I just go with that. It works great. So then, of course, medias are a fundamental concept of CSS. And so there's this really cool feature in Sass called mix-in content. And so what you can do is you can kind of pass a block of code to your mix-in, and then this will come to your mix-in as @content. And then you can use that to place it or decide if you want to place it at all or repeat it several times. And so we do this to create we create mix-ins for each breakpoint that we want to use. And that makes it really easy that when we're creating some module and it has some adaptive behavior to different media types, we can just like include these mix-ins and then say, do this with the styles in there. And then Sass kind of bubbles out the media query to the top level because it wouldn't actually be valid to have media queries nested. And then, of course, like browsers hate height, so we try really hard to not put height on anything that isn't absolutely positioned, or that has a scroll bar, of course. Because things want to be stretchy on the width, they're going to have their width set by how the browser is set up, and then the content needs to flow down. So don't set height
This is especially hard for designers to accept because we like to know that our beautiful, pixel perfect design is going to go live looking exactly like that. But it's incredibly important that we let go of that. Pixel perfection is a pipe dream that's never going to happen outside these teeny tiny little pony spaces where we never are. So you're designing for a flexible medium. You're designing for flexible human beings. You yourself should be flexible too.
But doesn't that cramp your style sometimes?
Well, it can. It can, but the thing is, we also have to accept our constraints. And to be honest with you, designers love working with constraints. That's why you have these artists who choose to work with a medium of toothpicks, because that is really rewarding to succeed within the constraints. We're like 2-year-olds. We need rules. So it's really important that when you're naming, you name with designer intent. And the designer has to make an adjustment. And they have to realize that UX design is not art. If you want to do art, go make a toothpick sculpture. UX design is science with an artistic flair. And so when you start thinking about what's my intent, what am I trying to do here? What do I need my user to do here? What am I trying to communicate or find out? You find that your designs start to change. But as designers are trying to name things, we start to find it's a little hard because coders have to name everything they make. Developers are making file names, they're making class names. The name is pretty important because that's what other developers are going to use. But designers, we can name anything we want because we don't as often share our files. So we have to adopt a new discipline, and we need some help from our developers.
And so as a developer, I like to think my job is not as like the name enforcer, like you got the wrong name here, go figure out a better one. I think our job is actually more to be more like a docent, like someone who will guide them through the name selection process and develop that shared vocabulary.
Absolutely. So we play this thing that we call the name game.
So for instance, like Krys will hand me some new design and I'll say like, hey, what are we going to call this new container? Because I know it's not something I've seen before.
And I'll say, that's a vibrant blue box.
I'm like that little flag goes off in my head, a vibrant blue box, like what if we change it to red later or something, right? So I'm like, why do we need a vibrant blue box?
And I'll say, well, it gets attention without distracting from the primary call to action.
Aha, so it's a secondary box.
And I'll say, no, because this box, the blue color on it that's how we indicate user information.
I know, I heard you say it. So it's the user box.
And I'll say, well, user box isn't vibrant. We actually need to call their attention here and get them to do something.
So then, it's not very generic, but how about a user to-do box?
And I'll say, oh my God, you are a genius.
No.
That's exactly it.
You are.
You are. But sometimes you lose the name game. Sometimes you talk to each other and your docent helps you and you just can't come up with a good name. You struggle and struggle. So there are 3 things you can do. The first is wait. Don't name it. Call it box number 1 or whatever you need to do, some placeholder so that it can be put out there and used. In the usage, you'll start to find some pattern or meaning that you didn't quite understand before. The second is change the design. Maybe the reason you can't find a name that's distinct from all your other names is because the intent isn't actually distinct, and you have something else already in your style guide that would do just as well and that serves that same purpose. Don't be arrogant, don't be attached to your design, let go of all that, and just change the design to be consistent. And last, you can always give up. You can pick 2 names. If it does 2 things and you just can't internalize the fact that it does these 2 things, separately, then pick 2 names. And as you implement it throughout the site and as you use it more, eventually some meaning is probably going to congeal.
But sometimes, like, that might, especially if you've lost the name game and they pick a name and you just really don't like it. I think developers have to let the designer win. Like, this is their idea, it's their intent, like, it's in their head. Who are you to say, like, that they've got it wrong? So trust your designer, let them go with their instincts. If they're wrong, they're wrong. Let them fail and learn from that process. And over time, they're going to get really good at naming. Krys is awesome now.
So now you understand the site gets big, it gets spaghetti, but you grok the fundamentals. So where do you start?
So I like to think that there's a progression of design over time. You start out with like a concept in the designer's head. You might prototype it. Then you would go through different variations, do user testing, maybe A/B testing live on the site, etc. And finally you get something and you like it, and you're like, all right, we're going to roll this out. We're going to use it in other places. And at that point, when you cross this boundary, that's when you start to go, okay, how can we factor this into our application domain and really start to get into the meaning of what we've created and see how it can be broken down and reused. And so then you can create your domain concepts, and then beneath even that, you have like these really core presentational concepts. Grid systems, I think, kind of fit into this layer down here. It's this super foundational. You could actually use it on any website ever. It doesn't matter. It's just completely presentational. And the structure of our website, sorry, it's a little bit small, but the structure of our website and the code really reflects this. So we have a folder called library, and in there we'll put lots of variables and backgrounds and all this stuff, but it's all mix-ins at that level, or variables or placeholder selectors. None of it actually emits any code if you were to import it. So then we have our foundation. This is where we put our core styles. This is where, you know, by importing these style sheets, you're going to have something that looks like your website. And then but those things are actually mostly imported into the features and pages and products that divide up your website. And, excuse me, and the goal here is to find ways of taking your foundation and reconstructing it together for maximum performance and really molding their style sheets to the traffic patterns you tend to have. So you probably have started with something that looks like this. I would say this is a pretty average style sheet. And I think the conventional wisdom is, you know, you're doing a really good job keeping your style sheets clean if you've alphabetized it. I'm not impressed. So how can we do better? So first we're going to start to we're going to look at these different styles. We're going to take those groupings that we had seen before of the different fundamentals that CSS gives to us. We're going to start to grab these and we're going to extract them out, and we're going to refactor this into basically the same. We won't change our markup. We're just going to keep this we're going to keep this in the style sheet and make some new, cleaner to understand object. And so we pull out all of our typographic styles and we make a new placeholder selector. Have you guys seen placeholder selectors in Sass? Awesome. And we can extend it. So now our example class will be added where you see reading text up there. Then we're going to do the same for our containers. Pull that out into a shadow box. Our background is going to be our calming background. We're going to pull that out. Our foreground for green backgrounds, we call it our green BG type. Extract that out. And then our spacer classes, or placeholders. And so when we're done, we've taken something that really described an object and was totally fine Sass code. And we've turned it into something that we can look at and actually like almost create a mental image of. You know, when I see that the example object on our page is going to use reading text and be in a shadow box and have a calming background, I can like picture it in my head. But when I see this is just property soup. I don't know what that means. I don't have a picture of it, and that's gonna make me slower. But you might have noticed that in that refactoring process, we've created more selectors, and we've almost doubled the size of our style sheet for this object. But I think this is okay, because we've taken something that isn't reusable, and we've turned it into something that has all these new reusable pieces, and this one little piece that is just describing that part of the page. Unfortunately, I think there's a sad reality here, which is if you were to do this approach with placeholder selectors and extend and use it all over the place, your style sheets would be huge. And I think this is just, like that might be okay in some cases. We definitely use extend in certain cases where like one module will extend others and things like that. But we don't tend to style objects of our pages using this approach. Instead, we use classes. So instead of placeholders there, I actually would, on our site, I would just use classes instead, and we would just put those on the example object. And it turns out that developers really like this. I find it somewhat offensive, but I'm a purist. But they can basically just bang out a page. They don't have to go and touch the style sheets at all, add their class names, and ship it.
Or even better, the designers can.
And it's actually not too bad because these names are globally unique across your entire website. So if you do have to find where they're used or whatever, you know, grep and awk and ack and things like this are all at your disposal. So this was a good start. And when you finally get ready to take something and start to reuse it across your site, I think you can start to get into the new approach of factoring those things out and getting into that the concept framework or whatever.
So designers have to do the same thing. We have to change how we think. Every page, every project, every feature has to be thought of as part of a whole, whether you're a designer or a developer. We have to follow that same thought path. And when you start doing that, a living style guide almost becomes inevitable because you're reapproaching all your fundamentals. So when I say living style guide, I mean different from the traditional style guide, which designers like me have made for time immemorial, which is a big, huge, ponderous document, either a doc or a PDF or a PowerPoint presentation that we've spent hours and hours and weeks and months and years and days slaving over, getting everything exactly perfect and specifying every color and every pixel width, and we disseminate it, and the second the email is sent, it's obsolete because I forgot to add that thing, or I forgot to change this thing, or this just evolved. So not only is it obsolete, it's outside the developer's workflow, because what developer is going to stop and go read a 30-page document when they have code to write? That's just not going to work. So it's important for designers to apply the principles of usability directly to our own work and to our own style guide. You would never ask someone using your website to go somewhere else and do a thing and then come back and use your website. No, you would put it right there in their workflow. So you do the same thing for your developers. You put your style guide directly within their workflow. So this is an actual screenshot of a page of our style guide. And it uses the style guide, which is exciting. And Krys's speaker notes are hidden.
Oh no, did I forget to say something?
Yeah, you have to say some stuff.
As a developer, I really like this approach because it's just so much easier to show rather than tell. So I can grab this HTML document. Ours is online. If you have your computers running, you can go to style.caring.com and check it out. But you can get in there, you can use your inspector, you can see how the HTML is structured, because sometimes it takes a certain structure of HTML to get something right, or there's a relationship between several classes, and you need to see like how that works together. and also like building out the style guide itself gives you a place where you can prototype and build these styles and test them in different browsers, etc., all before starting to hand them off to the people who are building the application.
Yeah, having access to the style guide itself, I can just write the code for any new modules that I design, and then I just hand in code. So it's common for designers to think of pages in terms of areas, distinct areas of the page, and distinct elements that go in those areas, but we also have to then break that down fundamentally into the building blocks, those fundamentals that Krys had in the bullet points of those elements. So not only have I now got a content area, I've also got a container, a background, a foreground, a typography. And it becomes, I start thinking of my designs as combinations of interchangeable elements. I think of them almost like Legos instead of as these mystical, unintended happenstance. I recommend starting with the content inventory and then look at what's around the content and what's within the content. It's always best to start working out from your content because that's why your users are there, is for your content. They're not there for your borders. And how does that happen? Well, let's take a moment for the doctor. And then we come back to the fact that design is not linear. It's wibbly wobbly. And so I have a UI library, and if you're a good designer, you should have one too. This speeds things up because my library exactly mirrors Krys's code. So I've got typography, I've got containers, I've got backgrounds. All of this, each item within those layer groups is named the same as the classes and properties in Krys's style sheets. In addition, I don't just think about the elements on the page, you also have to treat your interactions as design elements within your style guide. So people don't use a static comp, they use an application. They interact with it. So every form validation and every interaction, every state has to be part of your style guide. When you do this, your design process starts to parallel your dev process ridiculously closely. And I think if you happen to be the kind of person who can think that way, you suddenly start to be able to design in code. I'm not quite there yet, much to Krys's chagrin. So stay with us, we're wrapping up.
And so after doing this for a while and getting your team up to speed, you really start to discover that everything has its place, and you really know where to put it. Like you create a new class, you know exactly what file it's going to go in. And it's just really comforting to not feel like, as a developer who's making something new and adding it to the style guide, that they have to like ask the architect, where should I put this? Like, what's the right place for it? I like to empower the developers to be able to do things on their own.
Which is a shorthand for saying he's lazy and he doesn't want to be asked all those questions.
We brought our total CSS down from 3.5 megabytes to about 1.2. I think maybe back up to about 1.5 now. In total of CSS that we might serve across all of our pages. And that was simply by identifying the reusable patterns that were already there and just coalescing around them.
Yeah, that wasn't a redesign, that was just a refactor. And then I think one of the best benefits is that it really makes communication ridiculously efficient. I can hand in a comp to a developer, and if I'm not also handing them code, I can say, okay, this is an H1, that's a low priority area, this is a secondary button. And I've just described the whole page to the developer. I can even say things like, okay, it's a 2-column layout, but we're using this many grid columns for the left column. And the developer knows exactly what I'm saying because we have a shared vocabulary.
And you end up, because the different categories that we've seen here, you end up with incredibly low coupling between your different classes. And that means if you need to change one, you're not going to find yourself fighting getting that through the site and finding bugs because of it. It just naturally rolls out because you've drawn within the lines that CSS has given us, basically. And hopefully you've built something to last. When we set out to do this, we were really aiming to make a set of styles that could last the duration of the design, which would probably be like 3 to 5 years.
So there are some downsides.
That's true. There's always downsides. The learning curve is much higher. Like with CSS, you hand somebody a comp. They know all the CSS properties. They can reproduce it. If they're brand new, they're probably at your company. They probably build something the next day. But with this approach, now they've got this whole vocabulary to learn. They have to become accustomed to what the different names are that they're going to have to use.
They have to relearn grammar.
And of course, because we're using Sass, we have a system that's harder to debug. There's layers of abstraction, there's variables, there's mixins. It's going to be harder for them to get from point A to point B. As a note, Sass 3.3 is going to have source maps feature. So that means if you're in Chrome, you'll be able to just go into your inspector and you'll actually see the Sass file and what line each selector and each property came from. Nathan did a great job on that feature. Oh, and somebody from Google actually implemented a bunch of it. That was pretty awesome. And I don't like the classitis that we end up with this approach, but in practice, it actually hasn't turned out to be a big deal. But it was a lot of work. Building the style guide for us was a major initiative. It took at least a month to build out the style guide, and then I think we had our first feature on it after about 6 weeks, and about a year to roll it out slowly over the rest of the website.
And we're still not done. We're probably 80% rolled out.
Basically, as we change things, or like with the style guide, things are slightly more performant. So if it's super high traffic or whatever, we'll also go tackle it.
Yeah, we actually prioritized where we rolled it out by where the traffic was. And then all new development happens in style guide, of course.
All right, so that's really all we got. Any questions? Yes. Right, so the question is extend and placeholders going to be a viable solution in the future? Did you have something you want to say?
I was going to say you paid him to say that, didn't you?
So it turns out, so I've been pitching bringing this feature to CSS. I think it's not something, preprocessors have proven out that it's something that people like, that it's something that has value, and it's not hard to understand. And so hopefully it looks really promising that extend, at least, will end up in browsers in the not too distant future. David Barron, who is one of the implementers of CSS for Mozilla, actually wrote into the mailing list one day. He's like, I have this idea for something that's kind of like mixins, but not quite. It's much more CSS-y. And he went on to describe extend. He had kind of independently invented it. And I chimed in on the mailing list, yeah, that's basically Sass's extend, but the syntax isn't as good. And then, so now Tab Atkins is the CSS rep at Google. He's championing that idea, and going to be writing up a spec for it. And it's the feature that I think is the most like CSS, and I think it's actually not a controversial one. So hopefully that'll come soon.
You can help by also championing it every chance you get, please.
Yeah, if you want to tweet to the W3C, please add extend. What else?
We put him to sleep.
Placeholder selector. So the question is, how do placeholders and mix-ins compare, placeholders with extend versus mix-ins with include? And I would say that at some really basic level, they're kind of the same, where obviously the implementation differs, and so you might get less file size with one versus the other, just depending on how things work out. Placeholders, I think, are, I remember I would use placeholders more when I have like a common base class for many different styles, but not necessarily something that I would want used in my markup. Standalone, it doesn't really make sense. And so I think placeholders really shine there, where it's not really a class, it's just a thing that needs to provide a common set of functionality for several other classes. Does that answer your question? And mix-ins, I think, were just, so mix-ins really are, like, their goal is to work around the cascade. They just, like, plop stuff in wherever you want it, and you don't have to worry about, like, am I gonna inherit this or that? You're just gonna, like, it's like a hammer that you're taking to your style sheet. Extend is gonna work with the cascade, so you get the proper overriding between different properties, and there's just a lot less duplication. It turns out that when mix-ins were first kind of in 2.0, there's no arguments to them, and so I think we've gone through this phase where we took mix-ins and made them really much more powerful, and then with extend, we've kind of returned back to where mix-ins were when we first started. Yes? So the question is how much time it takes to, have we found ways to ramp people up and get them to see faster?
And I think there's a couple of different ways that we've found. The first is that Krys actually walks people through the style guide, which is great. He will sit down and show them the whole structure and say, and this is how it works, blah, 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 blah. And then every time I deliver a design, I annotate that design with the actual class names. If it's similar to any pages, I'll send them to those pages to look at it. And then additionally, in our version of DaVinci, we have explanations about how things are used, when and why. And DaVinci itself, or our style guide itself, our DaVinci, conforms to the style guide. So at any point, they can just find the thing they want to do in my comp, view source, look at the DOM, whatever they need to do, and it's right there, and they can just copy and paste. And we found that that sped things up a lot.
Yeah, I think one aspect of architecture is training, and I think it's a piece that goes overlooked. And so being able to explain things and kind of bring people up to speed. So, I mean, at scale, maybe having brown bags where people talk about how things work, or a training program where you walk people through it the first time. It's pretty informal at carrying.com because we're much smaller than LinkedIn, but I would expect that there to be like maybe pre-recorded videos and tutorials and things like that where you could start to guide people through whatever process you have, whatever it takes, whatever makes sense for your level of scale.
And this is something I do every time I bring on a new designer. They pair with me for quite a while. So they have a built-in mentor who knows the system really well. And I can explain. Now, I don't bring on designers as often as you guys bring on designers and developers. We don't hire as many people as you do. So that might be harder for you guys to always have a mentor working with a new person. But if you can even do a little tiny bit of that, it helps a lot.
So I was at the
Uh-huh.
brought up an interesting brought up
So the question was basically having naming conventions around your class names, and especially if you subscribe to to not using scoped styles very much, which Nicholas does, then in Sass, like the nesting would make the relationship between styles very clear, but if you forego nesting, now you need some other way to show that relationship. And so it depends on how you do what rules you create for yourself. But I think his convention is a nice one, and I agree with him. Like putting class names that have a presentational feel to them, that don't just describe the content, is incredibly practical, and I haven't found tons of downside from it. The only downside I have found is when we're doing like A/B testing, like live on a website, we might want to drop in one style sheet or another style sheet, and depending on just how big of a difference it is between these things. Obviously, if you're just changing colors or borders or whatever, that's trivial to do by just adding new styles. But if you had them both on the page for one reason or another, so then you might start to get into this place where having presentation in the markup is really getting in your way, because you'd have to generate different generate different markup, whereas it might be much easier to just drop in like A style sheet or B style sheet, and then you would get the different design that you're testing across the site as like a session parameter. And so that's where I found that to be kind of a detriment, is kind of in the experimentation phase of a feature. And so that's why I say go really unsemantic, go really not, or go really semantic actually early on in a feature's design, and then go unsemantic once it's nailed down. I saw him.
Yeah, we wouldn't be applying it to a site that exists already.
What would I do differently? So the Smacks book hadn't come out when we first started this, and after reading it, I definitely started to buy into some of the same ideas that that Nicholas was promoting at the W3C Conf. And I like those. I think it's a good system, and I can see a lot of benefit there. So I might give that a try.
Additionally, there have been a few times when you and I have hit our heads against the desk because the thing we want to build isn't architected quite like our final purpose for it was. And it would have been nice to take more time. We took 1 month to build the style guide. It was just the two of us working on it for a month. And it would have been nice to maybe take 6 months.
Not a luxury you have at a startup, but
No.
about some other hands. Absolutely. How many websites do we actually use the style guide on now? I think probably 5 or 6 different websites. Some of them are internal tools that we use in the back end. It's kind of like our Twitter bootstrap now. And when we add new stuff, it's just, so we actually use a gem, like a Ruby gem, to package up the style guide, and then that can get imported into all of our different Ruby applications. And so really it's just a matter of recompiling to pick up all the new styles.
We forgot to repeat the question, which is, does the style guide make it easier to keep things consistent across all our different sites? And I would add that it also brings consistency in much earlier in the process because of the fact that I've completely adopted the style guide process into my design process. I produce more consistent designs, and it really makes me fight to justify adding something new to the style guide. I really have to stop and think about what my intent is and what the concern is here for me to be adding something new that we don't already have, because what we have is pretty darn comprehensive. And so while you have a ton of different elements you can combine together like Legos to build your little brick house, the brick house always looks like the other brick houses because you're using the same bricks, and that helps a lot.
Do you get bored?
I never get bored.
That's a good question.
The question is, how do you handle exceptions, or does everything magically fit? So there's an exception every single day. And you have to apply a little self-discipline and say to yourself, okay, is this really a snowflake? We have that's our key word with each other. Is this really a snowflake, or can something else do? If it really is a snowflake, then you can build it just one off. You just write the CSS for it if you need to. The second time you use it, then maybe that's a thing that needs to be added to the style guide. But if you find that you have that exception every single day, and every time it wins, and every time it persists, suddenly you have a site that looks like the Winchester Mystery House, and you have not disciplined yourself enough. So my rule is that, yes, an exception comes up every day, but that exception wins maybe once a month at the most. I'm very hard on myself with my designs. And when I'm not hard enough, Krys is plenty hard on me.
The other thing I would say is like landing pages or like marketing pages, things like this. A lot of that stuff's not in the style guide. It might get built with the style guide as its base, but there's a ton of styles that we'll throw into those that are just specific to that page.
Especially as we've been changing our business model a bit, so we're trying all kinds of new things. I need to be able to move really rapidly and try crazy ideas that have nothing to do with what we've done before. I need to be able to innovate. So on those, the exception will win for that one page. This is this microsite I've built out here to test a concept. And if that ends up being successful, then I usually turn that, instead of being an exception, that gets adopted and used other places.
How well does the site handle mobile device? What's that?
How do you approach it is probably better.
Like mobile first versus desktop first? So we built, this style guide is now, was it almost 2 years old? Yeah, so mobile first might have been a word that people were tossing around back then, but it definitely wasn't like more of the accepted best practice that it is now. And that's something that I wish, like to your point earlier, I think I would have loved to have taken that philosophy from the ground up. But at the time, we had so many desktop users, so many IE users. Our demographics were quite elderly, actually, and so just having to make sure that the site looked really great in IE 7 meant that we took more of a desktop-first approach. But it wouldn't be what I advocate for most people.
And that might be one of the things we'd do differently if we had to do it over again. We both cringe. Our site responds, but it doesn't respond the way we want it to. And our ad sales exec is quite sad about that as well. So we probably would have spent a lot more time on that.
We definitely don't use, I think, what people would call responsive design. We use more of an adaptive approach. So we have some breakpoints, and the layouts will change, but we don't have like ultra stretchy, everything is done in percents sort of responsive design.
And one of the things we're really tossing around with ourselves right now is there's the big debate of, do you make one site that's responsive, or do you make a mobile site, or do you go application based? And it's something that we're trying to be very open-minded and think about, because we would love to just say, oh, we're just going to have one site and it's going to respond. It's a perfect world. But we can't necessarily say that. So it's a big debate we're having amongst ourselves.
We have a variable called responsive, and if that's set to true, media queries happen, and if it's set to false, media queries don't happen. And that's so that you can get that nice behavior where you can test the different breakpoints by just resizing your browser. But on pages where we don't want to take on the additional burden of testing, or we know it's always going to be used in a desktop context because that's where the
SEM
traffic's
pages.
coming from, then we just will say, this page, we're not going to go responsive with it.
It's a sad, sad reality.
I think more and more I've heard more and more people lately actually saying like, it's actually expensive to build everything responsive. Like, I think it's something you should think about on a case-by-case basis. Any other questions? We're going to kick around for a while. We can always take questions individually.
The question was, do developers sometimes forget to use the style guide?
We do a lot of code review, and so one of my primary job responsibilities is to just read a lot of code, and I'll just point out, I'm like, oh yeah, that was actually something in the style guide. Can you just use that instead of all this custom style that you wrote here?
And additionally, I QA everything. And that's something a lot of designers don't do, but I really feel that's important. So not only am I QAing it for how it looks, I'm QAing it for how it's structured.
All right, well, that's about an hour now, so maybe we'll call it a talk.